You're watching the JJ Podcast.
Whether you lean to the left or you lean to the right, speaking with a former Prime Minister is an honour. In this week's episode, we chat with Australia's 28th Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott, about identity in politics today. This includes identity politics and personal attacks on individual leaders, as well as the attack on Western culture. We chat about Liberal Party identity, Australia's identity, and we ask about why Tony decided to write his new book, being released later this year.
Well, Tony Abbott, 28th Prime Minister of Australia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jaimee.
You know, Tony, you've always been someone during your time when you were in government, and even now, where you're a real community-focused individual. You've been out surf lifesaving with Queenscliff. When I rang you to actually book in this interview, you had been at a hose holding course, and I said to you, that is the most random thing. And you said, oh no, it's just part of being when you're in the Davidson Fire Brigade. It's all part of it. And you, I think, are just the epitome of what it means to be a community-focused member when you're in Parliament.
Well, thank you for saying that, Jaimee. But for me, these sorts of things have come naturally. My dad was in Rotary for 40 odd years. My mum did Meals on Wheels. Margie, my wife, over the years has done a lot of community work. She ran Girl Guide groups. She did talking books for blind people. She was pretty active for the first few years up at the local school. So look, to me, it's just really part of my ordinary being that you should do what you can to be helpful to the community. And I really love the volunteer spirit, which has always characterised Australia. That spirit of rolling up your sleeves as individuals and as local groups to make change for the better, as opposed to either putting up with things which are bad or demanding that someone else, the government in particular, do whatever it is that needs to be done. I think that surf lifesaving is a wonderful manifestation of the Australian volunteer spirit. I think that the rural fire brigades, again, are wonderful manifestations. Just about every single sporting club is run by volunteers, or mainly by volunteers. And if we ever lost that, I think we'd be a different and a lesser country.
Absolutely. School PNCs.
Well, Tony, you know, we've just come out of a federal election, and it was a campaign that I felt as though we saw a lot of identity politics was playing out in that space, and in particular in regards to the Liberal leader at the time. And as a former Prime Minister who you've also been on the receiving end of this kind of targeting, what did you make of what you were seeing unfold in the federal campaign?
You're referencing, Jaimee, the fact that Peter Dutton was targeted for his looks and things like that, aren't you? Well,
looks and personality. And
He was labelled things that I don't believe he is.
yeah, look, as someone who's known Peter pretty well for more than 2 decades, he's a thoroughly decent human being, a very warm person. No one who ever met Peter Dutton would think of him as anything other than decent, caring, likeable, down to earth. But yeah, he was turned into a bit of a monster, a bit of an ogre, simply because, he doesn't have any hair, and I guess as Border Protection Minister, he had to do some necessarily difficult and tough things in order to keep our country free of the scourge of illegal migration by boat, which is not only a big problem for our sovereignty, but is incredibly dangerous for the people who are trying to get here illegally by boat. Under the Rudd-Gillard mini invasion, we had some 50,000 people arrive illegally by boat. It's thought that at least 1,000 people died in the attempt to get here in small boats on the open sea. We're certainly seeing at the moment in the English Channel a lot of drownings as people try to come illegally into Britain by rubber duckies, etc. So Peter did what had to be done. He maintained the policies of the Abbott government, which incidentally have been largely continued by the Albanese government, not because Labor likes them, but because they work. And yes, it was incredibly unfair. I think the big problem, if I may say so, in the last election was not that Peter didn't have what might be described as movie star good looks. We didn't have enough clearly articulated policy. That was our big problem. I mean, the Albanese government, I think, had been really a terrible failure in its first term. He'd lost the voice referendum that was his signature pet project. He'd presided over 2 successive years of declining GDP per person. There'd been a statistical 8% decline in Australians' real disposable income. And before Christmas, a substantial majority of Australians were saying that the government didn't deserve to be re-elected. Unfortunately, they concluded that we weren't ready to govern. And that's because we didn't have enough clear, strong, alternative policies out there. That's what brought us undone. And yes, there was a lot of very unfair sledging of Peter, but in the end, we didn't do enough to win.
Do you think that identity politics played a part in that, not just targeting Dutton individually, but the party platform and the policy? Did we fall into the trap of going down the road of speaking to small minority groups and trying to battle against that identity politics rather than focusing on the big major policy platform that the Liberal Party have always had as their priority?
Well, I certainly think that if you want to win an election, you appeal to people as Australians. You don't go out and target women and youth and migrants and so on. Because in the end, as Bob Menzies originally said, and as John Howard often said, the things that unite us should always be more important than anything that divides us. And the best instinct of the coalition is always to appeal to the national interest, to be, if you like, the patriotic party. And frankly, whether you're male or female, old or young, an immigrant or the descendant of people who've been here for 65,000 years, in the end, we're all Australians, we're one country, and I reckon that we should be putting forward policies that are going to benefit everyone. And so if we were, for argument's sake, going to put forward a substantially different childcare policy, I wouldn't be pitching this as some kind of special deal for women. I'd be saying this is something that's better for the nation, because the more kids we have, the more human capital we've got, and the more human capital we've got, the stronger we're going to be in the years and decades to come. I mean, likewise, better schools, that's not about appealing just to parents or indeed to kids. It's about appealing to everyone, because if we don't have young people who are curious, who are well informed, who have good characters, who have a love of our country, who have an appreciation of our culture and our civilization, we're directionless.
Absolutely.
In terms of looking at the Liberal Party, it's out in the press quite a lot now that they don't know who they are and they're trying to figure that out. With the messaging being just go back to your point, Menzies, and what it was traditionally formed upon, and stick with the true values of conservative politics?
Look, the right policy for 2025 is not necessarily exactly the same as the right policy for 1955, but the values and the instincts that were right in 1955 will still be right in 2025. Human nature doesn't change. Love of country shouldn't be different today than a generation ago. So I think that the fundamentals of the Liberal Party are absolutely sound, and we can go back to the Menzies We Believe statement, which certainly began with we believe in the Crown as the source of unity and the unity of the wider Commonwealth. And I think it ended with confidence in divine providence. We believe that there is no challenge that we cannot meet and no difficulty that we cannot overcome. Now, I think there's a lot to be said for the We Believe statement. If we come forward, John Howard used to say that the Liberal Party in this country is the political custodian of the Liberal tradition of John Stuart Mill and the Conservative tradition of Edmund Burke. My way of putting it as party leader was to say that as Liberals, we believe in lower taxes, smaller government, greater freedom. As Conservatives, we believe in the family, small business, institutions and values that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as patriots, we think that Australia is the best country in the world and we want to keep it that way. Now, I reckon that these should always be the foundations of our party, and what we need to do is apply our values and our instincts to the particular problems of the day. I mean, in the end, the job of politics is to make our country better, and because we're a successful country, that's never going to be, or it's very rarely going to be, turning the world upside down. It's nearly always going to be adjusting to deal with specific issues like fiscal incontinence, so to speak. I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to solve problems in accordance with good values, and we didn't have enough solutions to serious problems going into the last election.
So Tony, you've just touched on the identity of the Liberal Party, the core foundation and belief system of the Liberal Party. And you mentioned obviously that Australia needs to be united, patriotic. I had a look at what is commonly thought of as Australia's identity. Words and phrases and values like mateship, a fair go, the Aussie battler, multiculturalism, larrikinism, that the lucky country, they're all things that are often cited. Do you think that they are still words, phrases and values that would be at the forefront today?
Well, I think the word that, or the term that stood out from the others that you've just read, Jaimie, is multiculturalism. Now, we are certainly a multi-ethnic country, and we have been multi-ethnic from the time of the First Fleet. I mean, the First Fleet was full of Irish, Scots and Welsh, as well as English. There were Jewish people on the First Fleet. There were, it seems, at least a dozen black people on the First Fleet, because there were plenty of people from Africa in London in the 1780s, and some of them committed crimes and were therefore liable to transportation. So we've really been a multi-ethnic, if you like, a multiracial country from the beginning. Obviously, there were Aboriginal people here long before the First Fleet turned up, and Aboriginal people have been a part of Australia, obviously, from the very beginning. So we've always been multi-ethnic, multiracial. The concept of multiculturalism was really imported from Canada back in the 1970s, particularly beginning under the Whitlam government, although it was actually enshrined by the Fraser government. I've always had my issues with multiculturalism. I accept the reality. I welcome the fact that Australia has been such a happy home to so many people who've come here from all parts of the world. But one of the differences between contemporary Australia and the Australia in which I grew up is that back in the 60s, everyone who arrived were expected to integrate and assimilate.
To Australian culture.
Exactly. The notion of multiculturalism, at least in its more pronounced form, was to say to people, well, actually, you don't have to change at all. By all means, remain Vietnamese or Chinese or Italians or whatever, living in Australia. And I guess the way I've tried to articulate this issue more recently is to say, wherever you're from, we want to make you very welcome. But you've got to join Team Australia as opposed to simply live in Hotel Australia. And I've got to say that one of the more disturbing aspects of contemporary Australia is the tendency of recent migrants, particularly from the Middle East, to come with their old countries or their old homelands antagonisms and not to drop them. I mean, that appalling display on the 9th of October on the Opera House forecourt, where we had an ugly, angry crowd shouting despicable slogans against Jewish people. It seemed that a very significant part of that crowd were recent migrants. And I know that under the influence of strong emotions, we can all do things that in the cool light of day we might regret, but I just think it's more important than ever that we say to everyone who's coming to Australia, you are coming here voluntarily. You are presumably coming here to join us, not to change us.
Join Australian identity.
And joining us means integrating. Ultimately, it means assimilating, if not in the first generation, certainly in subsequent generations. And it absolutely means leaving old hatreds behind, looking forward, not back, and doing your absolute damnedest to accept that in this country everyone has equal rights, and it is utterly wrong to dislike people on the basis of immutable characteristics such as their sex, their race, their religion, etc.
You know, as we sit here, you're looking out the window and you can see the Australian flag blowing quite nicely in the wind here. I know you're not allowed to talk too much about it, but your book about Australia, a history, how an ancient land became a great democracy. You have a love for this country, as you've made very clear in this short time that we've been speaking to you. Where did the idea and inspiration and motivation come from to write this book?
Well, Jaimie, you're right. I can't pre-launch the book, so to speak, but I'm happy to talk about how it came about. One of the big issues for contemporary Australia is the relative amnesia about our history, and that a country which has forgotten its history is adrift. And so I decided that something that I might be able to do myself, rather than bemoan these depressing facts, was to try to change things using the authority that an ex-Prime Minister, at least in some people's eyes, has to tell our story, and to tell our story in a way which highlights the good as well as the bad. No objective observer could fail to be impressed by the high-mindedness of so many of the people who created early Australia, and by the decency of the vast majority of the people who have shaped our history in all the years since. I think it's a proud history. Certainly think it's a history that we should take far more pride in than be embarrassed about, and that's the hope that this book will remind people of all the good that's been done, and I suppose give them some important clues in terms of how to tackle the present and the future, because almost nothing that happens is unprecedented, and if you want to make a good fist of tomorrow, understanding all your yesterdays really helps.
This could be good for in schools too, because this is something Jaimie and I often talk about, because we've got children that are all in the primary school system, and they're almost taught not to dislike our history, but it's certainly not something that they are taught very well or highlight upon. You know, my youngest son I referred to him almost being cult-like, because he saw the Aboriginal flag and started basically praying to the ground about how grateful he was to live here, and he couldn't identify the Australian flag in the same context.
Okay, so I've got a grandson now at preschool, and every day begins, so I'm told, with an acknowledgement of country. Now, look, I think it's important that we have respect and goodwill towards Aboriginal Australians, but the country belongs to all of us. And if we're going to acknowledge people, what about the First Fleet? What about the original Anzacs? What about the people who keep our essential services going? Why single out one group of people based on ancestry? Now, the reason why we do this is because amongst many people who should know better, there is either a guilt or indeed a guilt tripping going on. Modern Anglo-Australians especially are supposed to be embarrassed about their white privilege, their male privilege, and about the fact that Aboriginal people were, in some sense, dispossessed from 1788 onwards. But the truth is, Australia was not going to go on as it had been. Someone was going to discover Australia, as we say of European settlement. I think we were lucky that it was Britain, not the French, not the Belgians, not the Spanish, not the Dutch, because if you look at the colonies of all of those other countries, the Indigenous people fared vastly worse than the Indigenous people did in the countries settled by Britain. So look, I'm sick of all this guilt tripping. A welcome to country is fine if you're going to an Aboriginal settlement, or if you're going to, say, an Aboriginal health service or an Aboriginal legal service, or something with
like NRL grand final or something
well,
like that.
I think it grates even there, to be honest, Jaimie, because
It's ridiculous. Did you see the opening of Parliament where every single person did it last week? It's like 30 of them.
it
was crazy.
It's become. I mean, you used the term cult. I mean, to the extent that Australia has an official religion these days, it's Aboriginal ancestor worship. I just don't think that's right, particularly given that the vast majority of Aboriginal people are actually Christians, and I think even for them a lot of this is a bit strange and unsettling, because the vast majority of Aboriginal people, as opposed to the activist class, they just want to get on.
Absolutely. They don't want separatism.
They want to get on in life. They want to get on with their neighbours, whether they're Aboriginal people or not. And the idea of being constantly welcomed to your own country, of having the flag of some people flown co-equally with the flag of everyone, it's a very recent political affectation, and the sooner we let it slide off and don't do it anymore, the better.
I think about when I was in America as a kid, and we used to literally stand at the start of every day in front of the American flag, hand on your heart, and you do your pledge to the US. Now, I'm conscious of your time, Tony, but there's one last question that a friend of mine, when her partner knew that we were interviewing you, wanted me to ask you, male role models.
Oh dear.
Yes, this was his got very excited and wanted to know, how can we put forward inspirational male role models, because there aren't any for kids to look up to.
And I said, especially when the identity of the strong male role models now is that masculinity is toxic.
Yeah. Look, that's a very good question. All of us know admirable men, and I think that as a good rule in life, where you meet people, male or female, who you like and admire, you should consciously or subconsciously ask yourself, what is it about those people that I like and admire? And then seek to incorporate more of those qualities into your own life and into your own character. So look, over the years, I've had some wonderful role models. My dad, often say that my dad was a better man than me, even though he certainly was never outside of his own circles. He was never a public figure. Some of my teachers, the well-known Father Emmett Costello was a great role model to me, almost like a second father for years. Once I started to get interested in public life, the late great B.A. Santa Maria was a role model. John Howard was a role model. My best friend in Oxford was an American Jesuit called Paul Mankowski, probably one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. Sadly, no longer with us. So I've had an abundance of really good role models, and everyone should find people who they like and admire, not because they're rich, not because they're
famous,
but because
they can tell there's a decency there, and do their best to model themselves on that person.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Jaimie and Jaimie, thank you, and good luck for the future.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.